What I want to talk about now is how it relates to mobile is that, legacy, and it's great to hear from all the sort of innovators and new companies coming in, but a lot of the stuff that's happening in legacy organizations is really quite interesting. Some of the confusions, the pitfalls, the discussions that we always have when it comes to using data, understanding audience. And it's gotten so much more difficult now because the device proliferation is just out of control. So right when we just started to use data and understand data for web, it's like, well, now we're going to throw 300 more things at you. And so what I want to talk about is, in my experience at the Post and at Wall Street Journal, and now with the journalists over at Scripps, how some of the sort of constant confusion points and where I think legacy organizations tend to face hurdles and what we can do about that to really integrate data and audience into the organization. So first is what I call sort of mischaracterizing mobile. And a lot of confusion springs from the fact that people are collapsing two different things, two very different things together. Really the only thing, and I've seen it across many different sites now, the only thing that really is about the same between a tablet and a smartphone is weight. Everything else, the experience, how people are using it, what they're using it for, is really quite different. And a lot of the confusion that people end up having is because they're collapsing that, and it's not something that's collapsible. So in thinking about your data, you should be thinking about the experience and thinking about the user all the time. Your data should always reflect what that user experience is and what they're trying to tell you about their product. The second is just too much focus on multiple device usage. So data shouldn't simply be just about audience sizing and knowledge sharing. It should really be about what is your data doing for you? What is it telling you to do? So if you're seeing high social, low search, what do you do? If you're seeing high search, low social, what does that mean? And so we constantly talk about these big, large numbers, but we don't take a lot of time to think about what do we do about it? What is it telling you? Next is getting lost in the caveats. We all fall victim to it. We focus a lot on this cross-platform inconsistencies. Is a page view on mobile smartphone equal to a page view on desktop web? In the end, I posit it doesn't actually matter that much. So even the most lauded and the best sort of media companies with these great paywalls and login service, they're still looking at single-digit percentages of their audiences that they have that information on, that they are actually getting a login. Nevertheless, an even smaller proportion who they're seeing cross-platform. So what we should be thinking about in our data is not about the inconsistencies, but about matching that data to the device, matching that data to the product and the user experience as much as possible. So focusing so much on that interrelationship, you're focusing too much then on such a small portion of your audience, and when you only have so much mind space, when you only have so many resources, you're going to be neglecting that much larger population. We're also mismeasuring success an awful lot. I say this all the time. If we're talking year-over-year growth, you aren't really talking data, because a year ago, everything looked quite different, right? And there's so much change that's happening that you're not, if you're so focused on, well, I grew, 42% year over year, well, that's great. But should you have been growing faster? What is your competition doing? And how does it actually relate to what your business is? So you have to think about goals and measure from there. So from the top of the funnel, that awareness, to then building that repeat user, and then going into getting a login, from there getting a subscription, and from there getting a membership, which then turns into loyalty, et cetera. And then those are your actionable metrics, and those are the ones that you model your business around. So that said, though, you really cannot fear measurement. So I pulled this quote off of Twitter the one time: using metrics as a measure of performance, though, would lead to popular journalism. I already see that on TV. Anyone who works in TV, we all know that we probably have the least amount of data. So anything that's happening there isn't actually the result of data. But what your business runs on uniques and page views. Fighting that and ignoring that is kind of a fool's errand, because at the end of the day, that's what gets people in the door, and it also is what actually serves the ads, which runs the business, right? But that is only the top of the funnel. You can't ignore it. You shouldn't ignore it, but there is more there. How you get your page views and to get your uniques, that's entirely up to you. It's your business, and everyone on the business side, I'm on the business side, we don't want that. Nobody actually wants pandering. They don't want you to go outside of your brand. They're selling the brand and they're selling an audience that's coming for the brand. So it's thinking about how you end up growing those within the sphere is where the entire business should align. And then what everybody should be thinking about all the time is sort of how do we create a relationship with the device proliferation. With so many, you have apps, you have mobile web, you have your tablet web, you have your desktop web. And they're not necessarily all interrelating. Nevertheless, if you have any vanity sites, if you have multiple sites, etc. So you need to think about how you can get and enhance your product so that you can get a login, so that you can have that relationship forming. But you need to provide them with something in return. And with that, the way you learn to do that is through experimentation. It's constantly playing with the data. And then you have to understand the experience. I'm going to talk a little bit about, I don't think anybody could argue that this is sort of what media companies are all based off of, right? It's the content that you create, the people who read it, and the ads that are served by it. Potentially, people are also paying for it, but still, I think the vast majority of our audience and the vast majority of our businesses still just rely on these sort of three elements of our somewhat pyramid here. But this relationship that we have between people and content, some people are doing this really well. You know, some newspapers are a good example. You've got Huffington Post, they know their people and they know their content well. Newspapers that have subscription models tend to know this really well as well. Then you also have the relationship between people and ads. And that's what Google is based off of, right? They know the people, they know the ads, and here they have their model. And then you have content and advertisement. This is sort of what magazines have been based off of. This is the new sort of native advertising, advertorials, etc. It's that relationship between the content and the advertisement. But what none of us seem to focus on is the fact that actually our business is all three of these things. And we haven't spent any time making sure that all three of these things are interconnecting. And what is sort of the best model? It's kind of what the newspaper model used to be. We used to know the geographic region of somebody, right? We used to know that here they were in this area, that store was in this area, and here's this content. We put high-end jewelry next to the business pages, etc. We put car ads next to car pages, and then we knew the content really well. And those three things worked, and that's why newspapers worked. We're still in that world. But what we have failed to do is actually make these data connections. Nevertheless, in an organization, we have failed to actually make organizational connections between this. And as a result, you're not going to win. You're not going to beat Google. They will always have more people and more ads to serve. I mean, you can grow your uniques and page views, but if you're not making that connection with the content, you're just going to end up running a lot of programmatic. And so what can you deliver that other people can't? And it's these three things together. And so how does it sort of manifest itself? You can easily see in the most basic example. So here we have a visitor to HGTV. We recognize visitor from registration and data appendages. We serve a recommendation engine that says, hey, I really think you're going to be interested in this content. And in this case, it's to try to get them to go over to kids' designs. And we serve a relevant ad in relevant context. And it's not a bad experience. That's in fact a very good experience. Remember when ads used to be useful? It was because it actually combined content plus ads plus people. But this is the world we're in now. Here we have the right buyer, but we stick the ad on completely irrelevant content. I mean, that's not going to work that well. It's just really not. And then, or we have the right content, but we failed the right buyer, and we failed that customer as well. So in neither case, I don't know, maybe she's buying it for her crazy grandkid. But in neither one of these cases, we're not serving the user very well, right? This is jarring. This is not a great experience, yet we're all delivering it all the time on our sites, and we think that this is the digital business model, right? Or this one, that's great, that's sort of the native that we're in, but imagine sort of lifting it one step further and actually delivering to your advertisers that user, that content that you do so well, and the correct ad. That's going to be great for them, and it's going to get them out of programmatic. It's going to get them out of essentially this model. So, oh, I have lots of time yet. So good, we'll have some Q&A. So just to leave with some of my thoughts here is that, so forget the caveats. Focusing on the caveats stops you from focusing on the user. And the only way to move the business forward is to start focusing on the user. Let your data reflect the experience. Don't force the data to match across all the devices. You're not actually providing the same experience, so don't force it. Be okay with these caveats. And push it back on the data scientists in your group, your analytics team. Make them match it. Make them make sense of it for you. You don't have to do that. Help in the collection of it. The more we all know about our content, it's amazing actually from either old CMSs or just an unwillingness to do experiments that we don't know a lot about our own content. And that's a scary thing. So even if you can't build out and grow this beautiful CMS, you can work with your analytics team and say, you know what? This is a product review, not a sort of design review. This is, except for all these different caveats, this is an investigative piece, not just a traditional in-depth piece, right? So you can work with them on this, and then they can start doing analysis from data that's not necessarily existing in their data set. But you have to work with your analysts on that. You can think about action with your data. Don't settle for information. I mean, I tell people all the time if I'm doing a presentation with data and it's just interesting, then I've failed, like I've miserably failed. It should be far more than interesting, right? It's not just about knowledge sharing, it's about what do you do with it? What do we learn from it, and what's our next step? And then always think about optimizing within the product. It's really going to be exceptionally difficult to optimize across products. But this is sort of my last words. I think delivering a great experience in one single area is more likely to get a repeat user, more likely to get them to try your other products than really anything else. You can spend your entire time trying to figure out their life cycle, trying to figure out how your desktop web works with your apps, but that's going to not get you very far. If you create the world's best app and you optimize it from the people that are going to it, you're going to have far greater success in getting loyalty. Oh, I have plenty of time for questions.
Questions?
I talk fast.
Laura, what do you think is the biggest hurdle that organizations face when they're trying to unite the content, the buyer, and the advertising?
So the content, I think, is likely their CMS, right? So what we rely on a lot is to take the data that comes from your CMS that exists on your source code. And if you're not automatically doing that and you're not having that sort of depth, there's some weaknesses there. There's alternatives, right? As you can start, many strides have come in doing sort of text analysis. You can ingest text a lot more. And so there is a way to overcome your CMS now, at least on the digital end. As far as the user, the biggest problem is not having a login strategy, not necessarily having any reason for somebody to want to give their information to you, right? So it's the reliance on cookies, which is a difficult thing to rely on and getting more and more difficult. But that's where I would talk about sort of getting that login strategy, thinking about why might somebody want to give their information in return for something else. And then as far as the advertising, it's because I think that's an organizational problem. We've been really unwilling organizationally to make those things come together. Advertising, I mean, companies I've been in, advertising is in a completely different building from everybody else. And just because the systems are together, it doesn't mean you're actually doing anything that's going to jeopardize the quality of your content. It's just you're putting your data systems together and you're working together to make that happen. So I think that's probably one of the easiest ones to overcome, because there's a lot of data, and ads is just bringing it through into your data warehouse, essentially. And then I guess that's the third one, is the infrastructure. So actually having a analytics and DW team that's sort of ingesting the data in and then creating feeds back out so it can be actionable. So you need to invest in that type of data structure.
Laura, I know that you have, I don't know if it's a joint venture or the business relationship with Hearst and maybe other publishers for magazine titles around your cable networks. Do those business partnerships let you grab audience data from the magazine side to mesh up with audience from the television side and help both organizations? Can you talk about that?
So very astutely, between Hearst and Scripps, we have a joint venture where we share the user. So both organizations have access to the user information, and then we have rules between us about the use of that information. So how often you can solicit to make sure that we're all aware. The feeds sort of come over into our data warehouse. And that's how we're able to get it. It's great. You know, we have in that case user's name and address. We also have our other usernames and addresses between sweeps. We give away homes. We do lots of contests, things like that from Scripps. So we've built out quite a large universe of user identities. It's interesting that you said how it helps with television. That's the difficult part, right? Because you can't get set-top box data at this time. You can get potentially a sample of it if you ask really nicely. I haven't asked nicely enough yet, so I don't. But even that is at a household level, right? And a lot of the data is individual level. So you have to actually think about your data structure in that way too. So instead we're doing a lot of work right now trying to figure out a linear viewer and mark them in our file through different ways. So whether they've gone on to chef pages, whether they are simultaneously watching if the show is on and airing for the first time with this recipe, and they've gone on the site and looked up that recipe, they're a simultaneous viewer, and we've marked them in our file, things like that. So, but that sort of set-top box data isn't available to us at this time.
In terms of integrating, I'm trying to kind of visualize how this plays itself out within an organization. And I think you've done a really good job of laying that out. But I'm practically thinking, you know, newsrooms don't talk with sales rooms, don't talk with data people, and so there's this silo that goes on in a lot of organizations. And I'm wondering if you have suggestions on maybe how to the shortcut to getting past that.
Right. So in my experience, what's been done is, like at the Washington Post, for instance, that the research and analytics and data team was separate from sales, was separate from business, was separate from news, and reported into the CEO and publisher. And that worked really well, right? Because you don't have anybody that's necessarily in the newsroom, you don't have anyone that's necessarily in the business side, but can be sort of that middle voice that really becomes the voice of the customer. And remember, sort of that experience is always best when all three are coming together. And so organizationally, you almost have to have a sort of that third customer unit that can bridge the gap on both. It's a hurdle to overcome to ask your news folks to meet with salespeople, and you probably, in many cases, maybe don't want to do that. But it's not a hurdle to overcome to ask your news folks to talk with your customer group, with your data team that's telling you what the customers are saying. And if you do have that hurdle, then there's other bigger hurdles coming down the horizon. So I think having that sort of separate centralized unit that's separate from both sales and news actually is the sort of best structural function.
So there's a bit of a debate now, particularly in digital native publications, where there's a closer relationship between the reader and the journalist, about whether that customer data should be shared or seen by the newsrooms, and there are some newsrooms that have said absolutely not. We're not going to encourage our journalists to go chasing clicks, and others that say absolutely, if you can give me a story that will get clicks, I'm all over it. Where do you come down on that? And actually, I'd love to hear from other people about where they come down on that.
So I think the number one thing there that people forget in that conversation is that there are managers there, and there's a brand there, and there's a desire across all groups not to go outside for clicks, right? In the end, you're going to be competing against, you have to find your competitive niche, and to go outside and do, I don't know, Lindsay Lohan stories out, you know, say in a Politico type of atmosphere, it's just not going to work. And it may give you those page views, but your advertisers are too smart for that. Your users are too smart for that. And that's not your business model. Your business model in that case is political news. And so you don't want to go outside. So the key piece is that, like, worrying about sort of the clickbait piece is to remember that there's editorial managers too that have a role and responsibility to make sure that the news isn't getting sensationalized, that it's not becoming clickbait. And that's the key piece. And that you are doing the best you can with what you have. And that's where data, that's why I talk about it as optimization, because you can see from it, if put in the journalist's hands, that their article has a 92% bounce rate. They're going to want to do something about it. And you know what they'll do about it? It's not that they're going to sensationalize. They're going to do in-text links. They're going to make sure that there's a gallery. They're going to work with their video team to make sure that there's a video. That helps the entire organization. But by sort of keeping that away, it takes away their ability to actually optimize and make it the best experience possible. Now, can somebody then say, oh, well, look, you know, if I would do that Lindsay Lohan story, but I would imagine their editorial manager would be all over them and say, that is not your beat, that is not your function. And so newsroom leadership really has to play a role in that. But to keep it outside, I think is personally a mistake, because it takes away their opportunity to think about, like, how could I have enhanced that story?
Yeah, I think I would love to agree with you, and I mean, in principle, I think you're right. I'm just seeing a whole lot of candy coating on otherwise perceived to be nutritionally valued news, and it's seeping in at the edge of a lot of different sites. And I think there's got to be a stronger line in the sand for us to kind of stand up for our brands, as opposed to clickbaiting, which we're seeing happening, I think, in an epidemic kind of way.
And it's probably sort of incorrect goal alignment, right? So if you're putting people to just have page views and not necessarily to grow within their particular area, or to not hold them accountable for repeat visits, or not hold them accountable for bounce rates, and instead it's just page views, you run a higher risk. So you have to think about the goals that you're putting on your newsroom in that regard. But overall, I think if you have a solid newsroom leadership, and if you have sort of a clear brand voice, which may be what some of the problems are, is that a lot of people don't know what their competitive niche is, haven't done their due diligence to figure out why users come to them versus everywhere else and what they come to them for, then you are more likely, I think, to fall victim to that. So again, sort of working with the business, working with the data department to say, what are our users doing here, and why? What is our niche? What is our brand, and what does our brand mean? And then I think that risk becomes smaller and smaller.
Hey, Laura, if I may, how do you make a decision about how much data about a user is too much for you to capture? Like, I mean, I imagine you can track, well, I mean, certainly you can track everything, but
yeah.
when you're trying to make sure you don't have just too much noise in your data warehouse, like, how do you balance that?
So I don't think we suffer from having too much data. I really don't. And even I think it's a good problem to have, that a lot of people, you know, that you're talking in page views, and it's lots of stuff on that page, and you're not collecting events, et cetera. There's so much more data to be had. So the noise is only a problem when you're talking to people in action, right? So the noise, if you're analysts, that shouldn't be a problem for them to clean it out, to think about it, to focus on what matters most, right? And then deliver that over to the people who are on your front lines, which is generally your newsroom, generally your ad sales department. So the noise responsibility lies on your analysts. But to sort of assume right from the start that it's noise and not collect it, I think is a big mistake. You can later determine that it doesn't make a difference and it's not part of the analysis and not worth it, but always start with assuming everything's worth it, and then go from there. But don't assume right from the beginning it's not, just for the sake of cleanliness, right? I think you lose a lot potentially in that process.
I think that's the final word. And see, all that time. Yeah. Oh, sorry.